Welcome, welcome everyone. We are here with Dr. Eben Alexander, who I have been excited about meeting for a very long time since I finished reading his latest book, Living in a Mindful Universe, which I could not put down, and then realized a friend of mine knew him and who's also in this series, and so connected us. And so here we are to talk about his story, his life, his wisdom, and so forth. So super excited to have him here. And Eben, I'd love to just give people a little bit of background on you before we get started for people who are new to your work. Dr. Eben Alexander spent over 25 years as an academic neurosurgeon at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. That's close to where I used to live in Boston, the Children's Hospital, and Harvard Medical School in Boston. Many of his patients over the years were rendered comatose by trauma, brain tumors, ruptured aneurysms, infections, or stroke. He thought he had a good idea of how the brain generates consciousness, mind, and spirit, until, that is, he was driven into his own coma in 2008. After a week in coma, memories of his life were gone, yet he woke with memories of a fantastic odyssey deep into another realm. In his words, more real than this earthly one. His journey brought key insights to our human understanding of the fundamental nature of reality, and his experience revealed that we are conscious in spite of our brain, that in fact consciousness is at the root of all existence. He envisions a more reconciliation of modern science and spirituality as a natural product, and we're going to talk about that today. He has authored several books, including Living in a Mindful Universe. So this is just mind-bending. You've got to pick this up. His first book, which was a New York Times bestseller, Proof of Heaven, and The Map of Heaven, which I haven't yet read, which explores humankind's spiritual history and the progression of modern science. So welcome. So happy to have you here.
Well, Renee, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with you today.
Yeah, I'm just so excited to dive into your life and some of the things that you've learned as a neuroscience and now as a teacher and speaker. But I'd love to rewind the clock a little bit for those who are new to your work or haven't read your books. So, since I know that you do address some of this in your books, what kind of man was Dr. Eben Alexander before your near-life experience in 2008?
Well, I basically had followed the standard paradigm of teaching, the conventional scientific teaching of the late 20th century. Materialism, physicalism is kind of the name of it. The notion that only the physical world exists and that therefore the brain, you must somehow muster consciousness out of interactions of purely physical matter. And I believe that. Now, my own father had been very influential in my life. He was a combat surgeon in the Second World War, but then came back to head up the neurosurgical training program. So he's very knowledgeable about modern science, neuroscience in particular. And yet he had a strong belief in God, and he'd grown up with that. Power of prayer was evident in his work. But for me, growing up in the 60s and 70s, I always knew science was a pathway to truth. And for me, religion had a lot of holes in it, and science was absolutely the dependable way to get to some answers. But like so many in our culture, I was sucker punched into believing that materialist science, that is a Newtonian determinism, that actually was eliminated from advanced scientific circles, 80 years ago because of the advent of quantum physics, is not the pathway forward. It's a cul-de-sac. It's a dead end. I love that quote from Heisenberg. He says the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences leads you to atheism, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you, because that's exactly what this deep study of conscious experience leads to, and away from that mechanistic view that so many of us thought was reality. But remember that mode of thinking would tell you we don't even have free will. materialist science thinks it's chemical reactions, electron fluxes in the brain. So in general, dismiss the concept of free will. And yet to me, my journey showed me clearly that free will was absolutely crucial in understanding this kind of journey in souls, our spiritual connection, and the deeper reality of our existence. So the me before coma was a card-toting, reductive materialist neuroscientist. I'd spent 15 years teaching at Harvard Medical School, thought I understood all this, but I was in for a deep lesson. And that's what my coma experience back in November 2008 gifted me with.
Yeah, and I don't think anything is really an accident, right? I think on our soul's path or our soul's journey, things happen in our lives to wake us up, right? To wake us up, or at least prod us to move into a different direction, to go deeper than where we've ever gone before. And not everyone comes through it with the same remarkable observations that you do. So I think it's amazing that you had the courage and the conviction, right, to come out on the other side and start speaking to different communities. So I'd love to talk about that a little bit, because you're not new to the speaking circuit. You were speaking all over the place before, right? So you weren't new to the stage. But suddenly you were going to different stages than you had before after you had come out of coma and come out of this experience. How has your NDE, for those who are new to that, NDE is like what people refer to as the near-death experience. How has that changed how you show up on stage? Is it more heart-led? Or, what have you noticed, and also what have others noticed about how you present now?
I would say it's a complete 180-degree shift, because before I was seduced into thinking, following the hard lead of that materialist science, into believing, there wasn't free will, that our existence, our awareness ended with bodily death and the death of the brain. And I now know that's absolutely false. That in fact, at the moment of death, we're liberated from the shackles of the prison, and our awareness becomes far, far grander. I mean, that's what near-death experience stories are all about. They've been going back thousands of years across all cultures. And what they demonstrate is that there are aspects of us that are much grander and more interconnected with the universe than how we normally think of ourselves in these bodies, living this kind of illusion of selfhood, as opposed to realizing that we're sharing this consciousness, this mind of the universe. And that's really where that binding force of love that is so obvious in near-death experiences is a tremendous part of the lesson. We're bound through these forces of love. We're all in this together. We're sharing the dreams of the one mind. These are all unifying, synthesizing kind of concepts that I couldn't have even remotely glimpsed before my coma. And yet now I have a very crystal clear vision of it. And what I've spent the last 15 years of my life doing since the near-death experience during coma in November 2008 is working with other scientists and other experiencers around the world to try to come to a better understanding of all this. And there are definitely some emerging models. I work with groups of scientists around the world, as I said. You can go to scientificandmedical.net or galileocommission.org to learn more about the various groups that I work with, but you'll see that there is a scientific revolution afoot, a paradigm shift that I would say has been about 5,000 years in the making. And we're finally putting the pieces together to get it. And in our book, Living the Mindful Universe, we combine those pieces in a form of what's known as consilience to show that the primacy of consciousness is very demonstrable through multiple lines of inquiry, whether it's the hard problem in neuroscience, the impossibility of trying to trace the material workings of the brain into phenomenal conscious experience, philosophy of mind and the binding problem, the apparent unity of consciousness in an individual, which is very tough to explain if you're still thinking it's a lot of neuronal populations cooperating in these neuronal networks of the brain. That doesn't fit that unification. And then you have all the evidence for non-local consciousness, telepathy, remote viewing, near-death experiences, shared death, which are just like near-death, but happen in perfectly healthy people. And then you have after-death communications. You have all the end-of-life dreams and visions. And then, of course, that giant literature that I didn't even know about before. But going back to the 1960s at least, scientific investigators who have rigorously pursued stories of past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation. And for example, at University of Virginia, these scientists have, in 2,700 cases they've investigated, they found 1,700 cases that they solved. That is, they found the person the child is describing. So in the setting of this gigantic body of evidence of non-local consciousness, of consciousness surviving from one incarnation to the next, and all these episodes of non-local consciousness, we clearly need a much bigger model of brain, mind, and consciousness than the simplistic materialist model that doesn't begin to explain any of it. And that's where I'm excited to point out that these scientific groups, like the two that I just mentioned, are very important spokespersons for this gigantic sea change of understanding that's coming to humanity. Interesting thing is, in many ways, it only mirrors the great wisdom of some spiritual traditions going back thousands of years. So just like that poem from T.S. Eliot, where we get to the end and find out that the beginning was at the end anyway, we're kind of sensing the same thing now. These deep and profound truths about primacy of mind and the unification that we're all in this together is becoming very apparent, and the science supports it. So quantum physics is right there at the core of this discussion of consilience, but primacy of consciousness is really the prize.
Beautiful. I love that. I wasn't going to go there, but the fact that you brought up the evidence and the research of kids who have had these profound experiences, remembering things, I've heard about that too. I didn't realize it was you said 1,700 cases. That's quite profound, right?
That's the number they've solved. That is, they found the person who lived before. And a lot of those cases go all the way back to the late 1960s. So it's an incredible body of work and very powerful when you start reading it. A lot of people say, well, I don't remember a past life, so it can't be real. Well, as these Dr. Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, who've headed up this research over 60 years at UVA, will tell you, you must harvest the memories before age 6 or 7. Because after that, they get covered over by natural processes. I think that's part of giving a skin in the game, so that at least at this stage of human development, we have a kind of a buy-in to this being an important event, this incarnation in this physical body. But ultimately, what we discover is we're actually eternal souls, and we tend to reincarnate, I believe, in soul groups, that it's all part of this kind of shared evolution of consciousness. But it's a tremendous process, and it can give one a great optimism and kind of hope about the human condition, to understand this kind of power of our eternal souls and coming back and again trying to get it right, growing towards oneness with the divine. It's a very comforting reality compared to that bleak and paltry fiction of materialism that tries to pretend that your brain is fully creating consciousness and is only limited to the here, now, in your little body sense of awareness, whereas we can show, through meditation and spontaneous epiphanies and many kind of events that happen to people, of connections far beyond the here and now with departed loved ones, things like that. That's what really kind of, awakens our culture. And these are not uncommon events, like the middle of the three books that you mentioned, Map of Heaven, is all about that, about the commonality of these experiences. They're not just, that you read the occasional New York Times bestseller and find these amazing events. You can ask your neighbors, and you will start discovering that they don't talk about them, but that many of these people in our lives have had these very same extraordinary experiences. So they demand a much richer explanation than just a dismissal, which is what materialist science, the way I used to kind of dismiss if my patients tried to share a story like this with me. I didn't diminish their hope, but I thought, well, it doesn't fit the theoretical model, so I guess dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. That's what they told me. That's what I believed. I was my own worst skeptic from the get-go. But ultimately, in reviewing my medical records and talking it over with my doctors, going through the scans and everything, I realized something very powerful had happened. As the medical case report written on my medical records, published September 2018, Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, Dr. Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson that case report makes it very clear my brain was in no shape to have any kind of dream or hallucination, much less the most extraordinary, memorable, detailed, and transformational set of events in my entire life, and all happening in a deep coma that should have killed me. How is that explainable? In fact, the doctors who wrote the case report were challenged by the peer review editors. How do you explain this case? It's unprecedented in the medical literature. And they said it's because he had a near-death experience that this very unusual and remarkable recovery could occur.
Yeah, which is really hard for materialists. I mean, I think we've got two things going on. You mentioned the medical and scientific community, and they're glued and wedded to this materialist view because guess what? If they say anything different, all their research papers, all their work, all their proof of their ego selves, right, which elevate them in their own scientific communities, all of that falls away and says, you're wrong. And they don't want to be wrong. That's part of it, right? That's part of it. It's this ego at work that, science is really supposed to be about forever challenging, forever probing and going deeper, right, into what we don't know. But when you're a well-known materialist scientist and you've got your name on all of these papers, that's pretty threatening to not just their own identity and ego, but it's threatening to an entire industry. So that's piece of it. And then the other piece of it, I think that you talked about is people are afraid, and they're afraid because they're going to be shut down or told they're crazy. So I think conversations like this, right? I think they encourage people and allow them to go beyond their fears and be able to speak what's on their mind without threat of being either shut down or told by someone you're crazy.
Well, that's really the important stuff. And, people who've read the book Proof of Heaven will realize how events that happened 4 months after my coma that helped to solidify the identity of a spiritual guide that I had deep in the experience, who was crucial to me. That was a turning point for me. I realized I could no longer chase away all the facts of this case and pretend that it was a vast hallucination, that I had to pay big attention. And from then on, it's just been working with scientists and other experiencers to try and come to a deeper explanation. And along the way, finding out that there's far more evidence supporting this position than I ever imagined before. And really also sharing the story has been very liberating because I hear from thousands of other experiencers and have over the last 15 years since, I started sharing my story. And of course, the 10th anniversary edition of Proof of Heaven just came out, and that has 36 additional pages in it that will inform people about a lot of what else has happened in the last 10 years since that book was published. So it's really all about this world will change on its own accord because the evidence leads that way. But ultimately, it's taken a bunch of scientists and literally hundreds of scientists around the world who've gotten involved in this field over the last few decades to help really point the way forward. And for those who want to glean some of the benefits of that scientific community, I will also suggest to your audience go to bigelowinstitute.org. And that's a website. It has 28 winning essays from 2 years ago that were all from scientific investigators, all having had at least 5 years of experience investigating the afterlife question. And Robert Bigelow, an aerospace engineer out in Las Vegas, challenged the scientific community. What's the best scientific evidence for survival of conscious awareness after permanent bodily death? That was the question. And you can read 28 essays worth of answers that affirm the reality of the afterlife from a scientific perspective from many different directions if you go to bigelowinstitute.org. So we're accumulating the evidence. It's no longer a question of whether you want to say, well, that's all nonsense because I don't believe it. It can't be. The scientific evidence at bigelowinstitute.org is very, very, very compelling. And I just would urge people, if you want to know more and you want some answers to this question, those answers exist. But of course, living in a mindful universe is our effort to provide answers along these directions. And you'll find a lot of similar thinking in many of those Bigelow essays.
So let's talk about the experiential part, because we do know, right, that there's a lot of evidence out there. And thank you for pointing us to that, because we'll make sure that everyone has those URL links. Let's talk about the similar experiences before you even learned that the evidence was out there, right? So you come out of the coma and your son encourages you to write everything down that you remembered and the feelings and emotions and all of that you had. 20,000 words later, right? And here we are, and you've got a few books out, and I'm sure some of those 20,000 words ended up in your books. But if you were to distill that or those original writings right after it all happened that were super fresh in your mind, what were the three aha moments, the aha experiences? Forget about the evidence, forget about the scientific research, the feelings, the emotions, the transcendent experiences, if you will. Can you describe that for people?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's important to point out that certain aspects of those realms are much more real than this world. That it's the word we use is ineffable, means that they're not describable by our earthly language. Our language is great for describing a trip to Disney World, but these journeys can be quite a bit more exotic than that. And it's an unusual mode of knowing. I mean, first of all, just listen to the words that people use to describe a life review, where birth, death, everything in between, all the events of one's lives can be experienced simultaneously. That should give you an idea of just how powerful and kind of otherly that spiritual realm is. I mean, a realm where you can witness things across time without any restrictions based on any time flow in that realm. It's what I call deep time or meta time. And that's what it's the first amazing thing to note about this is that when you can experience all parts of your life at once, the interconnections and the reasons that certain things that might not be apparent to you when you look at it as a linear narrative, but when you're getting this exotic position of looking at your entire life at once in a life review, the interesting thing is it's not only from your perspective. As Bruce Grayson, who's MD's written about NDEs for more than 45 years as a skeptical investigator, he says that the majority of these experiences are described as reliving the events from the perspective of all involved. So you're no longer stuck in your personal perspective, which means if you've been busy handing out a lot of pain and suffering to other people, in your life review, you'll be on the receiving end of that. And that, I believe, is where our concepts of hell came from. People who had dished out enough badness on other folks that when they had to feel it in their life review, it wasn't a very pleasant thing to go through. But it's always positive and always nudges us in the proper direction of loving and caring for each other. That's the direction that all these experiences take us into, because they are pointing to the reality of one mind, this God mind, and that we're all sharing that. We're sharing the dreams of that one mind. And it's all in a process of grace and of transformation. So this, when we use the word reincarnation here, it's not about some blind mechanistic wheel that you're actually trying to get off of, as in some interpretations of Buddhism. But this is more about a grace-filled growth and transformation as we all learn and teach and evolve towards a greater wisdom around our relationship with the universe and the very reason we're even here. So all of this can be very positive and transformative, loaded with meaning. And the other important thing is you don't have to have an NDE yourself to participate in this. Meditation, centering prayer, different ways of going within, of exploring the mental realm. You start to discover you're sharing the mind of the universe, not just your own little mind. And this is where it gets to be very exciting, but also we have a responsibility to use these kind of powers and this growth for the higher good, because that's what it's all indicating, is we're all truly in this together. This is about learning more about our fundamental nature. And this is where you can take these stories, but then use personal experience through your own regular program of meditation. For me, I use differential frequency brainwave entrainment of something. Sacredacoustics.com is where people could learn more. We talk about that a lot in Living in a Mindful Universe, but it's a very powerful technique of basically causing neuronal oscillations of activity in the lower brainstem through listening to slight different frequencies to the two ears. And that's what can give us such an extraordinary experience of liberating conscious awareness from sense of self and the illusion of here and now.
So let's talk about our conditioning, because whether you grew up with traditional Christian or Judaic or Islam, right, any of the three Abrahamic religions, because in other parts of the world, it's a little different. I mean, most traditions believe in reincarnation, or a lot of them, I should say, do believe in some form of reincarnation, but not others. And we've had our own indoctrination here in the West with the Abrahamic religions. And it sounds like, your father had some kind of experience or relationship with God. So you grew up with some of that. But I'm curious, right? I'm curious because as a neurosurgeon, suddenly your publisher says, we want to call this proof of heaven. So I'm curious what you went through in that process where the publisher wanted that name. Were there any triggers that came up for you? Was there friction? I mean, obviously I get it because the name in itself, like you're going to want to pick up the book with a name like that. But there must have been some resistance on your side, even if you had, some connection to God. What was that experience like for you?
Well, the title that I took to the publishers was N of one. That's like a medical study. We talk about N, that's the number of cases in the study. And this was such an unusual case that I just said it's an N of one. And then it turns out there was a huge meeting up in New York with a publisher and various media outlets. And the media outlets were very excited about this because one of them in one of those meetings says, this is proof of heaven. And once they heard that, the publishers started to run with it. I said, that's a ridiculous title. For one thing, proof is not a concept in science. You don't have proof. You have proofs in mathematics, but in science, it's always about hypothesis, experimentation, and refinement of understanding, but you don't have a proof. And then heaven was such a giant buzzword. I didn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, even though it was certainly, kind of indicating a direction that this, my experience might lend some information about. But to me, I wanted to keep it scientific. I mean, I'm a scientist, and my approach in understanding this over the last 15 years has been purely scientific. And that's why I was so greatly relieved to find out how much work was being done, especially at a place only a few miles from where I live. That is University of Virginia, Division of Perceptual Studies. People can go to uvadops.org to learn a lot more. But I'd also like to make a few comments about what you said earlier about religion, because in essence, the whole argument we're making is based on the modern science of consciousness. And this involves quantum physics and neuroscience, philosophy of mind, parapsychology, et cetera, lots of different lines of evidence, but it's really all scientific. We're not relying on 2,000-year-old scriptures or anything like that. We're really just trying to follow the evidence of current human beings living their lives in the current era. And that's what leads to all this profound information. Religions have had thousands of years to try and teach us the golden rule, which is essentially at the heart of all the major kind of moral and ethical systems. And they've done an okay job at various levels of that. But NDEs are really the tip of the spear. The near-death experience itself, when you study that, you start to realize you can get a lot of answers. If you're not trusting religion, it turns out a lot of the answers parallel a lot of religious thoughts, because the NDE community will tell you first and foremost, we're all in this together. We need to take care of each other. The more we can show kindness, compassion, mercy, acceptance, when necessary, forgiveness for our fellow beings, the more we're following the proper pathway. And it's really all about love and unconditional love, which is so dramatically present in these deep dives. And that's where the life review, especially if you've been selfish or greedy, your life review in the ambience of that beautiful light of love can look especially embarrassing. So we really learn these deep lessons of love in these life reviews, in these passes through that spiritual realm. But the good news is people can duplicate that kind of thing through meditation and centering prayer, especially if they're aware of this literature. And in this discussion of religion and NDEs, I should point out a book by a colleague that I've found very helpful. It's called The Essence of Religions. It's by Robert Koppes, Coppes. And he's very knowledgeable about NDEs. And he basically uses NDEs as the gold standard. says, here are the lessons from NDEs. How well do religions stack up to that? And, to the extent that any religion focuses mainly on love, compassion, kindness, taking care of each and every one of us and not being exclusive, those religions are doing just fine. They're following the pathway the prophets laid out. But to the extent that a religion can get contradictory and conflictual and leading to warfare and violence and oppression of other groups, I mean, that religion has obviously gotten way too kind of lost and needs to be discarded. Those religions are of zero value to this world, actually cause a tremendous amount of trouble. But I'm not saying that you can't get a lot of spiritual energy and wisdom out of religious teachings if they're combined with centering prayer, deep meditation, of connecting with that spiritual force, but then living it in the lives that we live. Because simply meditating and coming in touch with these forces of love and compassion and kindness is not sufficient. We really need to bring that into our lives, all our thoughts and actions, how we think of and deal with ourselves and our fellow beings needs to reflect these deep and profound findings of the oneness of mind that all of us can discover through prayer and meditation.
We call it spiritual bypassing in spiritual communities, and that's where you have this transcendental experience yourself, and you're kind of lost in that and the ethers, and you don't bring it back to the everyday life, because that's what we're here to do. It's messy down here. It's messy.
Well, this is where we get the work done. Yeah. We don't get the work done up there. I kind of look at it like breathing. Living these lives is the big inhale, and then between lives is the exhale. But it's all necessary, the in and out, the incarnations, and progressive, as we've said, grace and kind of growth and transformation. Through multiple incarnations, we come to this much deeper, richer connection with that God force of the universe and with each other. That's why this kind of teaching is so important, because so many of the problems in our world, I would say basically all of them, result from the false sense of separation that is inherent in materialist thinking. Reductive materialism is kind of the generic name for the science I studied and worshiped before my coma. I don't use that term lightly, because reductive materialist science is a faith-based religion that actually has less to support it than the faith-based religions. And this is where it's important to point out that quantum physics basically disproved the assumptions of Newtonian determinism and materialist science 80 to 100 years ago. And yet so many people still haven't read the memo. And we're slowly but surely working to identify this role of consciousness. I mean, consciousness is the only thing that exists. The entire physical world emerges from the realm of the mental. And that is what we need to come to a deeper understanding of. But it's a cause for great optimism, because it offers humans the ability to have a tremendous input into the emerging reality for civilization, one that is far more hopeful, more focused on the higher good. And it's all through using love, kindness, compassion, and mercy as our main ingredients to how we deal with ourselves and others in every choice we make in living these lives.
Yeah, here, man. Well said. It's interesting. After all that, though, the publisher still won on Proof of Heaven as a title.
Well, the reality is, I think N of One probably would have sold about 50 books. And so my goal was never to sell books. My goal was to wake this world up and to help people. I knew one way to get there was to sell a lot of books. So I had to align with a publisher to do that. But the reality is, my goal is simply to wake the world up to a truth that I think is very liberating, refreshing, harmonizing, and leads to great prosperity and unification of this very fragmented and polarized world. That's the important thing to do. And that's why I've given more than 700 interviews and talks on this topic. And selling books was just part of getting there. But when you look at the hundreds and hundreds of free presentations I've got out on YouTube and other places, interviews, etc., you realize this is simply a mission. I'm simply trying to help other people. Yeah. And they've helped me. I mean, the way people have, experiencers have come out of the woodwork to tell me their own stories, literally by the thousands since I started researching all this after my own NDE. The world has been very beautifully cooperative. And it's really just time to try and overcome the madness of our modern falsifications of understanding, come to a deeper truth. And in many ways, people kind of get this and know this. They feel at a deep level that a lot of what I'm talking about, this binding force of love, is something they've recognized in their own life. But it's nice to kind of wake them up to the fact that science is perfectly compatible with all this. I mean, there's a myth out there among some people that our conventional science says afterlife and reincarnation are impossible. Not at all. In fact, quantum physics completely opens the door to this primacy of consciousness in a profound way that allows us to explain. You have to look at the brain not as the creator of consciousness, but it's a reducing valve or a filter, it's a transceiver. But it's not even where memories are stored. We talk about that in Living in a Mindful Universe, how neurosurgeons over the last few decades have come to realize, it's interesting how there's never been a case of any brain resection leading to a loss of long-term memories. It's never happened. If it did, believe me, that would be reported. And then when you entertain all these reincarnation cases, some of which are 50 or 60 years between death of the prior life and incarnation and birth in this next life, you realize those memories are not being stored in a brain anywhere. So obviously there's a deeper information field that has to do with memory, has to do with consciousness, and the brain is only the stage on which it's presented to us. But in many ways, our consciousness can be expanded as we learn how to get into consciousness by traversing the veil and getting outside of our own local here and now and sense of self. That's through meditation, centering prayer, spontaneous epiphanies, what have you.
Everything you talked about correlates quite well with someone else we've interviewed in the series, and you probably know her, Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor.
Sure. Right. I don't know her personally. We've shared email exchanges.
Yeah, she's amazing. So she's actually in the current season, the one that just went live yesterday, in fact. But in our conversation, you'll probably find it quite riveting because there's a lot of similarities that she talks about in her own stroke. She talks about the 4 brain characters, and you can give them names. It's quite humorous the way she does it, right? And how we've only thought about the right brain and the left brain, and how we don't actually think about there's 2 parts to the right brain that are actually operating, and then there's 2 parts of the left brain. And if you can become more aware of how they all operate, you can actually have a conversation with them and say, hey, left brain, shut down a little bit. I want to be over here in my blissful right brain state. And to understand how to go there, right? And right. Be in that place of oneness and connection and all of that. That is like something that you can proactively do with awareness and practice. And I thought that was pretty profound. And it really matches quite well with not only your own experiences, but everything that you just said.
Right. Well, I will say that Jill Bolte Taylor's book, I read it a few months after my coma, and to me it was very eye-opening because a lot of what she described was kind of familiar territory, and especially as she just became one with everything with this gigantic sense of love. I mean, to me, what happened with her was she was able to have an arteriovenous malformation rupture in Wernicke's area, in her receptive speech area of her temporal lobe, and that's what gave her this liberation, this sense of love and oneness with everything that is. Now, I went a step further. I simply took out my entire neocortex with meningoencephalitis. That's what those CT and MRI scans showed me, that it was a global disruption of my neocortex and even my brainstem affected on day 1. And I know where that led me in terms of oneness and love and identity with the universe, every bit of that. So when I read Jill Bolte Taylor's book, it was, for me, very, very kind of refreshing and liberating, affirming and validating, because of the similarities of taking down with a bleed in your speech area and then taking your entire neocortex. Yes, there are going to be similar themes that get revealed through these kind of dramatic medical situations.
Yeah, it was profound. And I think, you'll find so many parallels with her latest book, Whole Brain Living, as well, which, just, for people who have come out of science and tech like me, and are now venturing into the spiritual realm and trying to make sense of it all in a way that's validating and concrete and respected and makes sense and all of those things. It's just, wow, right? More and more of the science is coming out with the evidence. And really, it's people like Jill and like yourself and people like you and probably the institutes that you're working with. You're the brave ones, right? Because the spiritualists, we know it through experience, right? We have these experiences, but it's not really taken that seriously. So, especially if it ventures away from traditional religion, which most modern seers and spiritual mystics, if you like, it does venture far away from religion. So, bravissimo to people like you who are doing this kind of research and work. And let's talk about that for a minute, the resistance that you've gotten in the community. So, and I know some of it came as a result of the name Proof of Heaven. That's why I did want to talk about that. And I get it, right? I mean, you're going to have all these naysayers, and then they're going to look at that title and they're going to use that as ammunition against you, unfortunately, right? But it sold a lot of books, and that's what your publisher wanted, and that's what you wanted. So,
well, plus it got the word out to a lot of people. Right. Exactly. And there were a lot of people who would never buy into anything those materialist scientists would say, but who pay a ton of attention to my account of my journey because it resonates with them. It reminds them of things, some of whom may never have had an NDE, and yet they write me and they claim this deep sense of memory going all the way back to before their birth about the nature of reality. So this can be very valuable to everyone. I mean, not just, if the people want to stomp on religion, that's their own kind of problem. But the reality is, we're talking about modern human experience and things that can be scientifically validated. Now, the important statement there, scientifically validated, I'd like to point out a quick little issue. And that is, if you think that neuroscience, is going to be your pathway to understanding consciousness, and you want to study something like psilocybin and the phenomenal experiences that magic mushrooms or psilocybin engender, you might want to do fMRI and magnetoencephalography of the brain, things like that, to really take a deep, close look at the brain. But the shock, as we found in 2012 with the first of those scientific papers, is that the brain doesn't have any neural correlates that follow those phenomenal experiences. The brain goes dark. The brain isn't doing it. The brain is getting out of the way. So if, as a scientist, you want to study, what is the nature of these phenomenal effects that come through the use of such entheogens or psychedelics, and never call them hallucinogens, because that implies that what they're showing you is not true. What they're showing you can be some very deep truth. But the reality is the brain is not doing it. The default mode network, which is probably one of the most identified networks for kind of here now sense of self, dissolves. The ego dissolves. And so if you're expecting neuroscience to answer all those questions, you've got to stop. We need a deeper line of inquiry than materialism to start to get to those answers. So that's just an important point about kind of the scientific approach to this. It matters because you're going to find dead ends that you might try and pursue on a materialist paradigm, and yet they don't exist because they're not relevant, or other things are going on, like the brain getting out of the way with the use of those serotonin 2A psychedelic substances.
Yeah, that's a really valid point, I think, because, you did get resistance. I know that was a long time ago, and I know you've made tremendous progress and shifts since then, and plus have a big community of supporters on the scientific side. But that must have been hard for you to deal with all of these naysayers. And, and I read about, in your author's note in the book, I thought it was really just well written, because you were talking about panels that you were on where it felt in some ways you were almost set up to fail because they wanted to take you down. Not, you had all this valid stuff, you had all of, this valid experience and research and data, and yet they didn't even want to listen to it.
Well, in this whole journey, I've always assumed I need to meet people where they are. I do not expect anyone to be sitting there, at my doorstep, all ready to run with the notion of primordial mind evolutionary panentheism, that those are the ways they think about the world. So I have to basically point out the benefits of this kind of understanding. And as much as I can, as a neuroscientist, as a neurosurgeon, I want to elucidate mechanism. I want to get right down to the nuts and bolts of ion channels, synaptic vesicles in the brain, and how top-down causality and mind over matter is working in this environment. Figure out, how does placebo effect work? How does spontaneous remission of advanced cancers or infections, how does that work? How does the miraculous healing in NDEs, which was what the doctors who wrote the case report on my medical records had to use to kind of defend why this recovery could happen, because the peer review editors of the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases had no idea how to explain it. And so to say, well, he had a near-death experience, and we know other cases of near-death experiences where miraculous healing has occurred. You would think people would want to pay attention to miraculous healing once you realize it's scientifically validated, that it completely defies expectations. And sooner or later, people do pay attention. And that includes a lot of those previous kind of critics and naysayers. Slowly over time, they start to come along because they realize the evidence all leads in one direction. We found, back in early days after Proof of Heaven came out, interviewers always wanted a skeptical materialist rebuttalist to be on the interview with me, to rebut me. And that usually kind of led nowhere because, there was no denying my experience. There was no denying the medical facts of my case. And they really didn't have any ground to kind of walk on. And we've given up on that lately. But I've also found that I think a lot of people, especially, for example, with that BigelowInstitute.org, those 28 essays are extremely powerful. And as a scientist, you can claim, to be too lazy or not to have had the time to read all that. But when you realize how much evidence supports afterlife and reincarnation scientifically gathered in those 28 papers, you start to realize this is no longer some debate between materialist scientists and those who support spiritualism and kind of oneness of mind, because all the evidence really leads to the spiritualism and oneness of mind, all the scientifically gathered evidence. So, pay attention to the evidence before you're going to enter this conversation. But the good news is the evidence is there for free to the reading public. BigelowInstitute.org, 28 essays. Start with Jeffrey Mishlov's winning first place essay. If you insist on absolutely demanding hardcore science in your essay, go to Bernardo Kastrup or Julie Beischel or to Pim van Lommel. He won second place. He's a Dutch cardiologist. He's been very important in this movement. He wrote a fantastic book called Consciousness Beyond Life. Those essays are a gold mine of information that supports the reality of our eternal souls in a spiritual universe.
Yeah, and also, of course, IONS, Institute of Noetic Sciences, has some really great Dean Radin's work, and Helen Wabe.
Helen Wabe and Dean Radin. In fact, I was just rereading Dean's book, Entangled Minds, yesterday. Yeah. Incredible. He has written at least 4 books I know of on these topics, and they're all very highly recommended. Dean Radin is one of the top investigators on Earth of these phenomena, and he's very skeptical, he's very open-minded, and he's very diligent in his scientific pursuit of the question.
And grounded. I find them all to be grounded. They're actually not too far from us, and Helene was in our series 2, our season 2, but loved the book because it validated a lot of the experiences that we've gone through with.
I guess you may have noticed I wrote the foreword for Helene's book. I was very supportive of her book on channeling and of her work. And Noetic Sciences is really doing incredible work. I had the great fortune of staying with Edgar Mitchell in Florida several times in 2013 when I was giving talks down there. Got to know him as a good friend. And he was the one who started Institute of Noetic Sciences after his trip to the moon, and sitting there at his breakfast table discussing that trip back from the moon when he could just gaze out the window and kind of daydream and had this incredible samadhi experience of awakening, of sharing the consciousness of the universe. I mean, to hear him share that with me personally was one of the greatest gifts of my life.
I bet it was. I can only imagine, right? I read about that you had this experience with him in Florida, and I thought, wow, man, to be a fly on the wall, or if you could have recorded that one, right? If you could
Absolutely. Well, Edgar, he will go down in history as one of the great, brilliant, sage philosopher kings of our era. For him to have that wisdom, talk about courage. That took some real courage back in the mid 1970s to start up an Institute of Noetic Sciences. I mean, what vision! That man his name should go down in history as one of the absolute leaders in this scientific revolution of understanding.
Yeah, you have these moments in life where you try to explain the epitome and the feeling and the emotions that you had. And it reminds me of when I was doing a Zoom call with someone I've kept in touch with for many years, the famous Herbie Hancock, the famous jazz musician. I met him at the TED conference years ago. We stayed in touch, and about maybe a year ago, a little less than a year ago, we were doing a Zoom call catching up, which, my heart was, because it had been so long since I talked to him. And I was going through dark night of the soul crisis. Why are we moving twice in a year? This is so much stress. Everything just felt like it was tumbling down. And I asked him his opinion about channeling, and I just wanted to get his take on it. And it was one of those probably similar moments that you had with Edgar, right? Where you wanted to capture it. And then he said to me, and I know it's recorded, but it was on his Zoom, not mine, so we don't have it. But he said something so profound. He said, we all have access to the universe, Renee. Most people just don't realize it. Because I said there was that moment with you on stage with Yo-Yo Ma, and you had never played together before. All you did was look, and I was in the front row, right, watching these two masters come together. They just looked at each other. They'd never practiced. They didn't know what they were going to do together. And I remember asking him at that moment before he went on stage, well, how do you know what you guys are going to do? I'm a musician, man. I have to play and practice. And he said, we just know.
Yeah. And that's a very good point. And essentially what he's telling you is we're sharing the mind of the universe.
Totally.
Because the universe has a mind. And one of the biggest mistakes of 20th century neuroscience and quantum physics is they were realizing how important consciousness was in understanding the nature of reality. But they go, wait a minute. We're thinking human consciousness. That didn't come around until humans in the last few 100,000 years. So how can consciousness be so fundamental? What they missed is humans borrow consciousness from the universe. Self-awareness is part of the universe. And that is what we share. And the more we can get out of our little ego mind and start exploring our connectedness with that universal mind, just as musicians can learn to play beautifully together, even if they've never done it before, it's because we're sharing that one mind. And the more we open to that world and that it is accessible to us, the more we can grow. And the growth, I would say, is beyond our any potential of our imagination in the current era, because so much of our current era is terribly influenced by the dead weight of materialist thinking and its limitations. And this is why you should always question your beliefs, and especially societal beliefs, because the vast majority of the time, they're falsely limiting you compared to what is possible. And that's where I think this whole revolution in human consciousness and understanding that we're sharing that mind of the universe and have far more power than we might have thought of before. This can be tremendously liberating and refreshing. And this is why I encourage everyone to pursue, a program of exploration, meditation, centering prayer, the different ways of going within, but come to question the universe much more and demand some answers from the universe. But it's not done at the level of kind of the ego mind and the little voice in our head, because the voice in your head is not your consciousness. I love how Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in the head the annoying roommate. Yeah. Yep, that's the best way of looking at it, because the consciousness we're talking about, the awareness, kind of the observer, that is a far grander, richer, deeper aspect of self that's interconnected with that primordial mind and with all the other minds of the universe. That's the part that brings us together. And that's where centering prayer and meditation can be so helpful at investigating those avenues across the veil and helping us come into a deeper understanding that's not just the result of our little ego mind, the linguistic voice in our head, following the rational and logical dots, breadcrumbs to get to some answer, but recognizing that we can just come into noetics. As Edgar Mitchell realized, we can come into knowing through exploration, through intention and attention to various issues in our lives, and come to a deeper understanding of those relationships and how we can be influential far beyond the bounds of what materialist science would have told you we can do.
Yeah, so true, right? So true. This is a nice segue into actually reading something from your book that I just loved. And this goes into other dimensional realms. Cynthia Bourgeois, right? She calls them subtle realms. Different masters and teachers call them different things. But and also, people I know who have had psychedelic experiences, right, tap into this as well. So this is from your book, Living in a Mindful Universe. You write, since my brain was unable to produce a hallucination due to its overall neocortical incapacity, it became apparent that the ultra reality occurred because the experience was real, which is what we've been talking about. Though it did not occur in our four-dimensional space-time of this observable, I love that you put observable, physical universe. And then later in the same chapter, you talk about how when we reduce the visual, auditory, and tactile stimuli that we regularly get hit with on a daily basis, then we can move more and better be able to connect to that collective mind, which you've touched on. We've touched on, it's been kind of going in and out, that collective mind. So you're essentially not just validating what the early quantum physicist came up with, but also Einstein, right? And his, God does not play dice and all of that, right? You're validating and taking it a step further. So this collective mind, which people have talked about in different ways, it's really like what you were just speaking about, that the consciousness is always emerging. And God, I loved what you used. You said, we're just borrowing it. Can you go a little bit deeper with that?
Right. I would say that there really is one mind, and all of the physical universe emerges from that one mind. Our brains serve as transceivers that allow us to harvest a small eddy current of that primary consciousness that we have access to. And that eddy current is what we kind of live with. But, at night in dreams, we kind of escape out of the here and now and sense of self. We in the dreamscape, we can become many other kind of features of all that. But that's just one example. I mean, the experience with those plant medicines and theogens, the psychedelic substances, is another kind of means by which we can realize there are grander realities, bigger realities than just this little material world that we think is the be all and end all. And so it's all about connecting to that primordial mind, to that more fundamental consciousness. And by intentionally investigating into it. And for me, what that involves is regular meditations. Every day I meditate an hour or two. I use sacred acoustics. Again, as I said, I was attracted to differential frequency brain waves about 2 years after my coma, because I wanted to get into deep meditative states, and I wanted a powerful tool. And to me, that looked like something that would fit the bill, and it's absolutely worked beautifully for me over the 15 years since then, of the 11 years or 12 years that I've been using it. But it's that oscillation in the lower brainstem that allows us to be set free. And I've learned to just ride those tones of sacred acoustics. My little ego mind can state a request, an intention, maybe ask a question at the beginning of the meditation. That's often how I kind of set the stage for the meditation. But then I've learned to ride the tones as I listen through headphones to sacred acoustics tones. And that's what enables me to put that little ego voice, it just drifts into timeout. I no longer have that monkey mind chattering away and kind of interfering with my conscious awareness, and I get to that state of non-self, which so many meditators have reached, but sometimes they don't even know how they've gotten there. But it's where you're completely a complete dissolution of ego. In many ways, it can be completely thought-free. But what I have found is that often the universe answers those questions at the beginning of a meditation, deep in the middle of the meditation, by presenting me with scenes and with facts, with noetics, with knowings. There are many different ways the universe can offer that information. I'm sure you, as a developing your interest in channeling, are familiar with some of those kind of techniques and issues. But to me, it's been a fascinating exploration. I mean, once you realize that your mind is much more than just something going on between your ears inside your skull, but that actually involves the entire universe, that can be very, very exciting and liberating and refreshing. And that's certainly what I've found. But it's that connection with that primordial mind. I mean, the stories and NDEs and all these experiences, after-death communications, end-of-life dreams and visions from the hospice world, every bit of it just shows that binding force of love and our relationship to our fellow beings, and how those relationships are the important feature of the universe. That is what is contributing to the transformation of all of consciousness and evolution of this primordial mind.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought up sound, by the way, because sound and vibration, I mean, we know that through the sound healing work that we do, and that not only that we do in our own work, but have experienced, right, as recipients. And, and you even brought up that music, sound, and vibration were essential for you in your NDE to access the full spectrum of the spiritual realm, right? And so your final destination, I love what you wrote here, was the core, far beyond all space and time, right? That Einstein said so many years ago, and Heisenberg and, David Bohm and all of these great leaders of early quantum physics, and that it brings you to the very boundary between the infinite, eternal oneness and the emergent universe. Just and of course, that's a segue into our season on cosmology. So wait till you guys tune into that one, because that's bringing everything that we're talking about here together with cosmology and the emergent universe. So I have two more questions. I know we're running a little over, but two more quick questions, only because they're important ones.
Okay.
You brought up heart math, and we're huge fans of heart math. Roland McCready is in season 2 of this program, actually. Their research speaks of how the heart's electrical field is 60 times greater than the brain, meaning that the heart generates the strongest electromagnetic field in the body. And in other words, the heart sends more information to the brain than the brain sends to the heart, right? And so, in other words, it has a mind of its own. So some might be aware of this who are listening, because you might be aware of HeartMath's research. But for those who are not, wow, right? This is super profound. What's the usefulness of this in our daily lives? Because there is usefulness to this knowledge, right? Knowing just how powerful that magnetic field of our heart truly is.
Well, I think the usefulness would be very well pointed out by my co-author of that book, Karen Newell. She has been very influential in my life for the last 11 years. She's a co-founder of Sacred Acoustics, and she's been a great spiritual mentor to me. But early on, I was still very much that, former Harvard neurosurgeon, very much up in the head talking about brain, mind, and consciousness. And she kept reminding me over and over again, it's really all about that love. The binding force of love, which is the undeniable core ingredient of all of this, if it's based in near-death experiences and those kind of experiences, because that unconditional love at the core of the universe is absolutely essential. You can't have a discussion about those kinds of experiences without referring to that incredible power of unconditional love that binds us together. And it's a form of heart consciousness. That's the kind of the reminding phrase that pops into my mind from Karen when I think of this. But it's to help me never, ever to omit the incredible power of that binding force of love and coming to a deeper understanding of our relationship with the universe at large. You can try and paint it in some kind of cold, mechanistic, materialist scientific fashion, but ultimately, this deep and profound truth is very welcoming to human beings with their kind of acceptance of things like love and compassion and kindness and comfort.
Yeah, I think, even though the divine masculine and feminine exists in all of us, regardless of what sex we associate with and identify with in this particular lifetime, but I think right now the whole emergence of the feminine and masculine balancing, and I think Karen sparked that in you. She ignited that, right? Bring that masculine more in balance.
I am fully educated, thanks to Karen, on this notion of the masculine and feminine energies within us all, and realize how important it is to have them balanced, in many ways. And that helps us to really grow as beings. It's important to point out that, our soul does not have a gender. And so in these reincarnation stories, you'll often find people coming back as a different sex than a previous incarnation. So don't be hanging on to your gender is so important. And that's what was so, to me, powerful about that core realm. It was a complete resolution of all dualities, so that masculine, feminine, dark, light, evil, good, every bit of it came together into a unified whole of a loving oneness of understanding.
Thank God that love is emerging, right, as a core message, regardless of sex, regardless of, gender identification, regardless of color, regardless of political beliefs, right? That's really the thread and the underlying glue that binds us together as, you could say, human beings, but I like to say energy beings having a human experience. Right?
We are spiritual beings, energy beings. And yes, this physical appearance is very useful for a while, but it's not who we ultimately are. And I look at each and every one of us as light beings. To me, that just makes a lot more sense. And the light being is a more idealized form of each and every one of us.
So the last thing I'm just going to mention here, and it really points to something you've been repeating over and over again, which is that importance to go within. You've mentioned it consistently throughout the interview, which I so appreciate. And I love that you brought up in your book, your latest book, the Temple of the Oracle at Delphi in Greece, because I've been there. And on that temple is inscribed, "Know thyself." And it actually reminds me of a quote that I have on my personal blog: just trust yourself, then you will know how to live, right? It's that really about that inward journey going within, which you keep bringing up and saying, do it through meditation and prayer and anything that gets you there, right? And I think that's a really important message that you've been saying. We certainly do it in our own teachings, is that no way is wrong how you get there. If it's a walking meditation, if it happens to be, for me, it's on a paddleboard out in the lagoon, right, where I just commune with the ducks and the geese, it doesn't really matter. It's your own internal and inward journey. And that really supports what you said. Don't listen to how you've been conditioned in society, right? You've got to go inward for that journey. So I love
that. The ego mind is not your ally in that. That's ego has fear and anxiety as its main tools, and this is all about discovering that you're a far grander soul than that little ego is allowing you to be. So that's what all the meditation, all the learning, all the teaching, every bit of it is about transcending the kind of ego desires that can be so enslaving and misleading.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So what's next for you? Is there another book on the horizon? I know you're teaching, you're doing work with Karen, but what else is on the horizon? Or is there anything that we haven't covered that you would love listeners to know about?
Well, I think another book is definitely in the offing. The question is exactly which direction it should take, because there's several kind of major lines of inquiry that I think have opened up in the last few years to take us beyond living in a mindful universe. And as a scientist, I'm always fascinated by mechanism. I really want to get at mechanism. But the thing I find is it's so seductive to try and follow our normal pathways of causality through the material realm, and yet that's where you keep hitting the roadblocks. So it does take a bigger expansion of consciousness. So another book will be in the works in the next few years. I'm not sure how long it's going to take. I don't want to put another book out there unless it absolutely takes this world to another level. Living in a Mindful Universe is a book that does that, but I think there's enough evidence now to take us to an even higher level if I can consolidate it all in a proper fashion. I would just encourage people to stay in touch with me through the website, ebenalexander.com, through sacredacoustics.com for meditation. Also, very important, go to innersanctumcenter.com, INNER sanctumcenter.com. That's a site that has multiple offerings for learning more, many of them free, some of them need payment. For example, there's a mental health course for healthcare practitioners in there that with Dr. Anna Yusuf that I think is very valuable, but that does have some cost to it. But there's also a monthly webinar we do with fans who are interested in our work, and innersanctumcenter.com is a way into that. And also a whole series of interviews we did during the pandemic with thought leaders around the world, other experiencers, to better define this issue of the scientific kind of elaboration of consciousness. And that whole set of interviews is also there at innersanctumcenter.com.
Beautiful. All right. Well, we will definitely point people to those URLs, as well as the links to your books on the subsequent pages. So, just profound work that you're doing solo, that you're doing with Karen, that you're doing with the institutes and other scientists who are as brave as you are to step forward and finally speak their truth, right? Which is breaking down these barriers of separateness and Maya, right? We didn't talk about Maya or the illusion, but we talked about it indirectly, right? The Maya and illusion that all the great ancient sages and mages have spoken about for thousands of years. That's really kind of what this is when we realize.
Well, in many ways, in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we talk about the supreme illusion. And in many ways, that is the Maya. And that is the simple observation that even though the brain and mind are very clever at convincing us that all the out there is out there, the reality is what you're witnessing is a mental experience within mind, period. It's nothing more than an experience within mind. And it seems to have some fidelity to a world out there. But the biggest message of quantum physics is there is no objective external reality out there. It's like each one of us has our own physical universe we're walking around in, and we assume that they're the same physical universe. But the findings of quantum physics drive you very strongly to recognizing that, no, it's not an objective physical universe out there, that each and every one of us has access to that we have a tremendous amount of influence on. And that's where the real power comes into it.
Right. Like Herbie said, we all have access to the universe, or Deepak said, we are the universe, right? How many books, Adam Becker, What is Real, right? All of these books and all of these people on the science side and the academic side are pointing to, right, what is real, right? This isn't it. Energy is real, right? We can get our heads around that. So if we start thinking of ourselves more energetically of how we impact each other, I mean, that's all the work that Heart Math is doing with coherence, right? So back to the heart again, which is where it needs to be.
It's all about heart and authenticity.
Yeah.
And sharing these stories. And that I love it that so many more people are coming out and sharing these stories, because that's what ultimately will wake this world up.
Well, hopefully this interview, and I'm sure it will encourage others to do the same. And so that spiral effect, right? The exponential effect, right? Into the universe, it will go, and we will all make a big shift in consciousness.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Renee. Great talking with you.